The frost-bitten wind was a blade against her skin. Sarah stood on the auction block, a slip of a girl in a threadbare tunic, shivering under the harsh glare of 100 calculating eyes. She was the last, the final offering at the annual mating market of the northern clans, a place of hope for some, a place of final, public humiliation for her. She kept her gaze fixed on a loose stone in the courtyard floor, a small gray imperfection in a world of unyielding granite. It was her anchor. Do not look up. Do not meet their eyes. Do not let them see you break. The auctioneer's voice boomed, a gravelly sound that scraped at her already raw nerves. And finally, from the lands of Lord Fenrir, we have this one. He did not even use her name. A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd of alphas and betas. It was a sound she knew well, a mix of pity and contempt. An omega, yes, the auctioneer continued, his tone apologetic, as if selling damaged goods. But flawed. She carries no scent. The words were a physical blow. Flawed. Scentless. In her world, a world of primal instinct and powerful pheromones, an omega without a scent was a barren tree in a lush forest. Useless. Unworthy. An empty vessel that could never call to a mate, never soothe an alpha, never build a family. She was a ghost, invisible to the very senses that defined her people. Her father, Lord Fenrir, stood near the front, his arms crossed over his broad chest. She could feel his shame radiating from him like heat from a forge. He had tried for years to mask her condition with oils and herbs, but the truth was always a stark, empty space where a sweet, alluring fragrance should have been. He had finally given up. Today, he was washing his hands of his defective daughter. "What use is a scentless omega?" a gruff voice called from the crowd. "Good for warming a bed on a cold night, and little else," another shouted, followed by a burst of cruel laughter. Each word was a stone added to the weight on her shoulders. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white where she gripped the rough fabric of her tunic. Inside her mind, she fled to the only place she had ever known peace, the memory of her mother's smile, a secret garden of warmth in the frozen wasteland of her life. Her mother had been a gentle soul, a scented omega whose love had been a brief, beautiful song, silenced too soon by the harshness of her father's world. "Be strong, my little winter rose," her mother's voice whispered in her memory. "Your worth is not in what they can smell. It is in what you can feel." But feelings were a currency with no value here. "We will start the bidding low," the auctioneer sighed, resigned. "1 bronze coin. Do I have 1 bronze for the girl?" Silence. The wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the emptiness in her chest. Not one. Not even a single bronze coin for a lifetime of servitude. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot liquid filling her throat, threatening to spill from her eyes. She was worth less than a sack of grain, less than a lame horse. Then a new presence entered the courtyard. A hush fell over the crowd, so sudden and absolute it was like the world had stopped breathing. The jeers died on their lips. The laughter choked in their throats. A shadow had fallen over them all. Saris felt it before she saw it. A pressure in the air. A cold that had nothing to do with the wind and everything to do with power. A primal, terrifying authority that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Slowly, compelled by a force she couldn't name, she lifted her head. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, flanked by 2 massive warriors clad in black iron. He was a mountain of a man, draped in dark furs and hardened leather. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, his face carved from the very granite of his northern kingdom. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a winter storm, silver gray and filled with a chilling intensity. They swept over the crowd with dismissive arrogance, then landed on her. On the block. On the worthless, scentless Omega. King Vorlag, the Shadow King of the North. A name spoken only in whispers, a legend of brutality and cold fury. They said his heart was frozen. They said he had turned his own kingdom into a fortress of ice and fear, where weakness was met with death. They said no Omega had ever survived a month in his castle, their spirits broken by the sheer oppressive cold of his presence. He was the Alpha of Alphas, a ruler whose power was absolute and whose mercy was non-existent. And he was looking at her. His gaze was not like the others. It was not filled with contempt or lust. It was analytical, intense. It felt as if he were looking past her skin, past her bones, and into the trembling hidden core of her. No one moved. No one spoke. The world waited. Then, his voice cut through the air. It was not loud, but it resonated with a power that shook the very stones. 1,000 gold crowns. The silence shattered. Gasps echoed through the courtyard. Jaws dropped. Even the auctioneer looked as if he might faint. 1,000 gold crowns was a king's ransom. It was enough to buy an entire army, a fleet of ships, a noble's whole estate. It was an impossible price. For her. The auctioneer stammered, his face pale. 1,000 gold, your majesty? King Vorlag did not blink. His storm-gray eyes remained locked on Cerys. Is there another bid? The question was a challenge, laced with deadly intent. It was a dare to the world, a declaration. Of course, there was no other bid. To bid against the Shadow King was to invite death. Sold, the auctioneer squeaked, banging his gavel with a trembling hand. Sold to His Majesty, King Vorlag. One of the king's guards moved forward, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He tossed a heavy purse onto the stage, the clink of gold a deafening sound in the stunned silence. He undid her chains with rough efficiency and pulled her from the block. She stumbled, her legs weak. She was property now, his property. She did not know if she had been saved or condemned to a fate far worse than being sold for a bronze coin. As the guard led her away, she risked one last glance at the king. He hadn't moved. He was still watching her, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. She was a puzzle he had just purchased, and Cerys had the terrible feeling that the Shadow King was ruthlessly efficient at taking his puzzles apart. The journey to the Shadow Keep was a blur of biting wind and gray, unforgiving landscapes. Cerys was bundled into a covered wagon, a concession to the fact that her new owner had paid a fortune for her and likely didn't want his investment to freeze to death. But it offered little comfort. She was alone with her terror. What did he want with her? Why pay so much for a broken Omega? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, tearing at her composure. Perhaps it was a political statement to her father, a show of immense wealth and power. Or worse, perhaps he had a taste for the strange, the broken, a cruel curiosity. The keep itself rose from the mountains like a shard of obsidian. It was a fortress of black stone, stark and brutal against the snow-covered peaks. There were no banners, no carvings, no softness. It was a place built for war and survival, not for living. Her heart sank. This was her new cage. She was led through massive iron gates into a courtyard teeming with warriors. Their faces were as hard as the stone around them, their eyes cold and suspicious as they took in the new arrival. She could feel their appraisal, their confusion. They could not smell her, could not place her. She was a blank space in their world of scent and hierarchy, an anomaly, a threat. A stern-faced woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun met her at the entrance to the main hall. Her name was Helga, the head of the household staff, and her eyes held no warmth. "The king has no use for you in his chambers," she stated flatly, her voice as sharp as a shard of ice. "You will work in the kitchens. Be grateful for the roof over your head and the food in your belly. Do your work. Stay silent. And stay out of the way. Here, weakness is a disease. Do not infect this house with it." Sarah simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The kitchens were a cavernous, steamy place of clanging pots and shouting cooks. She was given the most menial of tasks: scrubbing floors, peeling mountains of potatoes, hauling buckets of water from the well. The work was grueling, her hands quickly becoming chapped and raw. The other servants, a mix of grim-faced women and sullen men, ignored her. She was the king's property, a strange and expensive acquisition they didn't understand, and they wanted nothing to do with her. She ate her meager meals alone, huddled in a corner. She slept on a thin straw pallet in a cold, shared dormitory. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of hard labor and isolating silence. She never saw the king, and in a way, that was a relief. The memory of his intense, stormy gaze was enough to make her heart pound with a fear she couldn't name. It was better to be forgotten, a ghost scrubbing the floors of his cold, dark castle. One evening, a week after her arrival, she was on her hands and knees, scrubbing a particularly stubborn patch of grease from the flagstones near the great hall. The hall was empty, the evening meal long over. The only light came from a single torch sputtering in a wall sconce, casting long, dancing shadows. A pair of heavy boots stopped just inches from her hands. Saris froze. She knew those boots. Polished black leather, practical and utterly silent. Slowly, she lifted her head. King Vorlog stood over her, a towering shadow against the flickering light. He was not in his furs, but in a simple black tunic that did little to hide the raw power in his shoulders and chest. His face was a mask of controlled severity. Her breath caught in her chest. The bucket of dirty water beside her suddenly seemed like the most interesting thing in the world. She stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs. He said nothing for a long moment. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. She could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight. He is going to send me away, she thought. A strange mix of terror and a feeling she couldn't identify rushing through her. Or worse. You, he said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. She flinched. Your Majesty. The words were a whisper, stolen by fear. Come with me. It was not a request. It was a command, absolute and unbreakable. Her mind raced. Where was he taking her? To his chambers? To a dungeon? She scrambled to her feet, her hands dripping with grimy water. She wiped them on her rough apron, a useless, panicked gesture. He turned and walked away without a backward glance, clearly expecting her to follow. She did. Her bare feet were silent on the cold stone as she trailed in the wake of the most feared man in the known world. He led her through winding corridors and up a spiral staircase, deeper and deeper into the heart of the keep. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. They arrived before a set of massive oak doors, banded with black iron. One of the guards, a man named Garrick who seemed to be his second in command, stood sentinel. He looked at Saris with open suspicion, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Vorlog ignored him, pushing the doors open and striding inside. He gestured for her to enter. Saris hesitated at the threshold, her fear a living thing in her throat. This was his private study. It was a vast circular room, its walls lined with shelves groaning under the weight of books and scrolls. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill of the castle. In the center of the room was a massive desk made of dark, polished wood, covered in maps and documents. It was the heart of his power. "In," he commanded, his voice sharp with impatience. She scurried inside, feeling small and utterly insignificant. He closed the heavy doors behind them, the sound echoing with a dreadful finality. They were alone. He walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. The firelight danced across the hard planes of his face, making shadows move in the hollows of his cheeks. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a small worn chair near the hearth. She obeyed instantly, perching on the very edge of the seat, her hands clenched in her lap. What was this? What did he want? He did not speak again. He went to his desk, sat in his high-backed chair, and picked up a scroll. He began to read, the scratch of a quill on parchment soon joining the crackle of the fire. Minutes stretched into an hour. Saris did not move. She barely breathed. She sat in the small chair, bathed in the warmth of the fire, and watched the Shadow King work. She was a piece of furniture, a silent observer in his sanctum. And the most bizarre thing happened. Her fear began to recede. The frantic pounding of her heart slowed to a steady rhythm. The tension in her shoulders eased. The warmth from the fire seeped into her bones, chasing away the perpetual chill she had carried since arriving. There was something in the quiet of the room, in his focused presence, that was calming. It was an anchor in the storm. She watched the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the steady, deliberate movement of his hand as he wrote. For the first time since she was a child, she felt a sense of peace. It was strange. It was terrifying. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he set down his quill. He looked up, his gray eyes finding hers in the dim light. "You may go," he said. And just like that, it was over. She scurried out of the room, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. The next night, it happened again. A guard found her in the kitchens and escorted her to the king's study. Again, she sat in the chair by the fire. Again, he worked in silence. And again, that strange, inexplicable peace settled over her. It became their ritual. Every night she was summoned. Every night she would sit in the warmth, a silent companion to his solitude. He never spoke to her beyond the initial command to enter and the final dismissal. He never touched her. He rarely even looked at her. Yet, his presence was a constant. The other servants began to whisper. The jealous glares from the court ladies grew sharper. Helga's lips were permanently pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Saris was an enigma, the king's scentless omega, the kitchen maid who spent her nights in the royal study. She learned to ignore them. Their world of scent and status meant nothing in the quiet bubble of the king's study. In there, she was not flawed. She was not worthless. She was just present. One night, a fierce blizzard raged outside, rattling the thick glass of the windows. The king seemed more restless than usual. He paced before the fire, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. There was a darkness rolling off him, a palpable aura of pain and frustration. Saris watched him, her heart aching with a strange protective instinct. She saw not the fearsome king, but a man in torment. He stopped abruptly and slammed his fist against the stone mantelpiece. The sound cracked through the room like a whip. "Why?" he growled, more to the fire than to her. "Why is it not enough?" She stayed silent, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. This was different. The calm was broken. The beast was stirring. He turned his head, his stormy eyes pinning her in place. For a moment she saw something raw in them, something vulnerable and desperate that stole her breath. "They say you are a curse," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "A witch sent to weaken me. My council, my guards, They all think I am a fool for keeping you. Her blood ran cold. This was it. He was going to cast her out. Are you? He demanded, taking a step toward her. Are you a curse, little ghost? She found her voice, though it trembled. No, Your Majesty. Then what are you? He was closer now, looming over her chair. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. She didn't have an answer. What was she? A girl her father had thrown away? A servant? A silent watcher? He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them. Karis flinched, expecting a blow, but his touch, when it came, was shockingly gentle. His calloused fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. A jolt, hot and electric, shot through her. It was like lightning striking a dormant tree. Her skin tingled where he'd touched her, and a warmth bloomed in her chest, spreading through her veins. His eyes widened in surprise, a flicker of something other than anger in their depths. He stared at his own fingers as if they had betrayed him. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. He spun away from her, turning his back, his broad shoulders tense. Get out, he bit out, his voice rough. Karis fled, her heart a wild bird trapped in her ribs. That touch had changed everything. The fragile peace of their silent nights had been shattered, replaced by a tension that was sharp and thrilling and terrifying all at once. He did not summon her the next night, or the night after. The cold of the castle seemed to seep back into her bones. The silence of the kitchens felt heavier, more oppressive. She missed the warmth of the fire. She missed him. The realization was a shock. How could she miss a man so feared, so dangerous? A man who owned her? But she did. She missed the quiet strength of his presence, the unspoken connection that had grown between them in the firelight. On the third night, as she was scrubbing pots, her hands submerged in greasy water, Garrick appeared at her side. The king requests you, he said, his voice grim. Relief warred with apprehension. She dried her hands and followed him. He led her not to the study, but up a different tower, to a heavy, iron-bound door. He is unwell, Garrick said, his gaze fixed on the door. There was a flicker of fear in the stoic warrior's eyes. The curse is strong tonight. Be careful. The curse. She had heard whispers of it. A affliction passed down his bloodline, a darkness that was slowly consuming him. No one knew its exact nature, only that it was the source of his coldness, his infamous rage. Garrick opened the door and ushered her inside, closing it firmly behind her. This was the king's bedchamber. It was sparse and military, dominated by a large bed covered in dark furs. Forlog stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit snow. He was shirtless, and in the pale light she could see it. Veins of gray, like creeping stone, marbled the skin of his left arm, stretching up from his wrist towards his shoulder. They seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent light. The curse, made visible. He turned, and his eyes were not the stormy gray she knew. They were shot through with silver, glowing with a feral, untamed light. He looked like a wolf, poised to strike. You came, he said, his voice a low growl. She nodded, unable to speak. The air was thick with a raw, primal energy that terrified and fascinated her. This was the beast she had heard stories about. They all fear this, he said, lifting his afflicted arm. They see a monster. What do you see? She took a hesitant step closer. Her heart was pounding, but it was not entirely from fear. There was something else, a pull, an instinct she didn't understand. She looked at the gray patterns on his skin, at the pain etched on his face, at the torment in his glowing eyes. I see a man in chains, she whispered. His control seemed to snap. With a guttural roar, he lunged, not at her, but at a wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He splintered it with a single furious blow, his knuckles coming away bloody. He paced the room like a caged animal, the silver light in his eyes flaring. "It burns!" he snarled, clutching his head. "The cold. It burns. It wants to consume everything, turn it all to stone." Saris remembered her mother's words. "Your worth is not in what they can smell. It is in what you can feel." She had a gift, her mother had always said, an ability to soothe, to calm, a quiet empathy that was the opposite of the alpha's roaring power. It was a useless gift in a world that valued strength, but perhaps not here. Ignoring the screaming voice of self-preservation in her head, she walked toward him. She moved slowly, deliberately, as one might approach a wounded wolf. He stopped pacing and watched her, his body coiled, ready to spring. She reached his side, her hand trembling as she lifted it. She did not touch his cursed arm. Instead, she gently placed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. His skin was fever-hot beneath her cool hand. His heart hammered against her palm like a war drum. He sucked in a sharp breath, his whole body going rigid. She closed her eyes and focused, not on the king, but on the man. She poured all the quiet compassion she possessed into her touch, a silent plea for peace, a shield against the storm raging inside him. Under her hand, his heart rate began to slow. The tense lines of his body began to soften. The feral silver light in his eyes dimmed, receding until they were his familiar stormy gray once more. He stared down at her, his expression one of utter disbelief. "How?" he breathed, his voice raw with wonder. "The pain. It's quiet." He covered her hand with his own, pressing it tighter against his chest. His touch was no longer just a spark. It was a steady, powerful current, flowing between them, binding them. He leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing as if in prayer. "You," he whispered. "It's you." In that moment, standing in the heart of the Shadow Keep, with her hand over the cursed king's heart, Saris understood. She was not a mistake. She was not flawed. Her scentless nature, her quiet spirit. It wasn't a weakness. It was the key. The curse fed on the loud, chaotic energy of their world, on the powerful sense and raging emotions. But she was a space of quiet, a pool of calm water in which the fire of his curse could be quenched. For weeks, their new routine held. Her days were still spent in the kitchens, but her nights belonged to him. Sometimes they sat in silence in his study. Other nights, when the curse flared, she would go to his chambers and lay her hand on his heart until the storm passed. Intimacy grew in the quiet spaces between them, a shared look across the room. The brush of his fingers against hers as he handed her a book. The way he started leaving a warm, fur-lined cloak on her chair for when she had to walk back through the cold castle corridors. He never spoke of what she did for him. He never spoke of the curse beyond those first words, but she could see the change in him. The hard lines around his eyes softened. The oppressive aura of cold fury that clung to him began to dissipate. The court noticed. Garrick's suspicion turned to a grudging respect. The servants started to meet her eyes, some even offering small, hesitant smiles. She was no longer just the king's strange property. She was the king's calm, but with this new status came new dangers. Lord Malachor, the king's senior advisor and a man whose smile never reached his cold, reptilian eyes, began to watch her. His gaze was sharp with a calculating hatred. She saw him for what he was, a man who thrived in the king's winter, who feared the coming spring she represented. Isolde, a beautiful, high-born lady who had long hoped to be Vorlag's queen, now looked at Saris with open venom. Saris felt their animosity like a physical threat, but she pushed it aside. In the bubble of her time with Vorlag, she felt safe. More than safe, she was beginning to feel something else. something warm and dangerous and hopeful. She remembered the vow she had made at her mother's grave, a desperate, childish promise whispered to the moon. I will never bind myself to a man of pure strength, a man who rules with an iron fist and a cold heart. I will not suffer as you did. Vorlage was the epitome of that man, the Shadow King, a ruler of iron and ice. And yet, the man whose heart beat steadily beneath her palm was not a cold-hearted monster. He was a prisoner, fighting a silent war every single day. His strength was a cage, built to contain his own pain. Her vow and her heart were at war. One night the moon was full, a perfect silver disk in a clear, star-dusted sky. It bathed the snow-covered grounds of the keep in an ethereal light. Forlag did not summon her to the study or his chambers. Instead, Garrick led her to a small walled garden she had never known existed. It was a hidden sanctuary. In the center, a massive, ancient weirwood tree stood, its white bark glowing in the moonlight, its red leaves like drops of blood against the snow. The air was still and sacred. Vorlage was waiting for her beneath the branches. He looked different. He wore no armor, no grim tunic. He was dressed in fine, soft wools of charcoal gray. The tension was gone from his shoulders. He looked younger, more at peace than she had ever seen him. He smiled at her, a true, small, breathtaking smile. I wanted you to see this place, he said, his voice soft. It is the only part of this castle that remembers what it is to be alive. She walked towards him, her heart fluttering. The moonlight spilled like silver water over the snow, making everything look magical, unreal. It's beautiful, she whispered. Not as beautiful as you, he replied, his gaze so tender it made her ache. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. The connection was immediate, a circuit of warmth and energy completed. Saris, he said, speaking her name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. I have been living in darkness for so long. A walking ghost in my own skin, waiting for the stone to claim me completely. I thought that was my fate, to be the last of my line, a king of shadows and dust. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. And then you came. My scentless Omega, my quiet, my calm. You walked into my storm and were not afraid. You touched my heart and commanded it to be still. He took a deep breath, his chest rising. The moment felt heavy, pivotal. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. There are legends in my family, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. Prophecies of a mate who would be the balm to the curse, a mate who would not be found by scent, but by soul. My inner wolf, the beast I have fought my entire life, knew you the moment I saw you on that block. It screamed at me, mine. His words washed over her, a tide of revelation and terrifying joy. Mate, the sacred, unbreakable bond, the union of two souls, fated and eternal. I rejected it, he confessed, his expression pained. I thought the curse was twisting my mind. How could you, a gentle soul, be meant for a monster like me? But I was wrong. My soul knew what my broken mind could not accept. He dropped to one knee in the snow before her, still holding her hand. The great and terrible Shadow King, kneeling at the feet of his scentless, nameless property. Saris, he said, his voice shaking with the force of his declaration. You are the other half of my soul. You are my salvation. Be my mate. Be my queen. Rule by my side and let us banish the shadows together, forever. The world tilted on its axis. This was everything she had secretly, foolishly begun to dream of. A life with him. A life of purpose, of being wanted, of being loved. Her heart screamed yes. Her soul cried out for its other half. The inner wolf she never knew she had recognized him, her alpha, her mate. But then, the memory of her vow rose like a specter. I will never bind myself to a man of pure strength, a man who rules with an iron fist and a cold heart. She looked at Vorlog, the most powerful man she had ever known, the king who had bought her like cattle, the ruler of a harsh, unforgiving land. He had shown her his pain, his vulnerability, but the world saw only the iron fist. To accept him was to break the most sacred promise she had ever made, a promise to her dead mother, a promise to herself. And a terrible, cold fear gripped her. What if the vow was a protection? What if this tenderness he showed her was only a temporary reprieve, a result of his need? What if, once the bond was sealed and the curse was tamed, the cold, hard king returned, and she ended up just like her mother, a gentle soul crushed by a man of unyielding strength? Doubt, cold and poisonous, flooded her veins. She was unworthy. She was a kitchen maid. How could she be a queen? She would fail him. She would fail everyone. Tears welled in her eyes, hot against her cold skin. She pulled her hand from his grasp. The light in his eyes flickered, confusion clouding his face. Cerys. I can't, she whispered, the words tearing from her throat. It was the most painful thing she had ever said. Each syllable was a shard of glass. His face hardened, the hope draining away to be replaced by a familiar mask of stone. You can't? I am not what you think I am, she stammered, backing away. She had to make him believe it. She had to protect him from her own inadequacy, protect herself from a broken heart. I am a servant. A nobody. I cannot be your queen. I cannot be your mate. She rejected him. She rejected her fated mate, on her knees before her, under the light of the full moon. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. A strangled cry of pure agony was ripped from his chest. He clutched his left arm as the gray, stone-like veins erupted across his skin, no longer creeping, but racing. They swarmed up his neck, over his jaw. The gray leached the color from his eyes, turning them to flat, dead stone. What? Have you done? He rasped, his voice a horrifying parody of itself, like rocks grinding together. The rejection had not just hurt him, it had fed the curse, giving it a power it had never known. It was consuming him before her very eyes. He staggered to his feet, his face a twisted mask of betrayal and unimaginable pain. The tenderness was gone, burned away by a cold fury that was more terrifying than anything she had ever witnessed. You lie, he snarled, the words scraping from his throat. You felt it too. The bond? You deny it? You deny me? I am sorry, she sobbed, turning to flee. Guard, he roared, his voice no longer human. It was the sound of an avalanche, of a mountain breaking apart. Garrick and two other guards burst into the garden, their swords drawn, their faces pale with shock at the sight of their king. Take her, Vorlog commanded, his voice like cracking stone. He did not look at her. He couldn't. He pointed a trembling, half-petrified finger in her direction. Back to the kitchens. She is nothing. She will never enter my presence again. Garrick grabbed her arm, his grip hard but not cruel. He looked at her with confusion and a deep, profound disappointment. As he dragged her away, Cerys looked back one last time. Vorlog stood alone under the weirwood tree, bathed in the cold moonlight. He was clutching his chest, his body racked with tremors. He was a king being consumed by his own throne of shadows, and she, the one person who could have saved him, had just handed the curse its final, ultimate victory. Her heart had not just broken, it had shattered into a million pieces of ice. Life became a living hell. She was cast back into the drudgery of the kitchens, but it was 1,000 times worse than before. The brief warmth she had known made the biting cold unbearable. The hope she had foolishly harbored now mocked her in the silent, lonely nights. The castle itself seemed to mourn. The oppressive chill returned, heavier and more suffocating than ever. A grim despair settled over its inhabitants. The king was once again a creature of shadow and rage, but with his pain now amplified by her rejection, his temper was volatile, his commands merciless. The servants who had started to smile at her now averted their eyes. She was a pariah, the woman who had broken the king. Helga assigned her the foulest tasks, working her from before dawn until long after midnight. Isolde and her companions would walk by, whispering cruelties just loud enough for her to hear. The little kitchen witch thought she could be queen. Look at her now, back in the filth where she belongs. The king was wise to cast her out. She nearly destroyed him. Every word was a fresh twist of the knife in her heart. She deserved it. She had done this. Her fear, her stupid, cowardly vow, had unleashed this misery upon them all. She saw the exhaustion and fear in Garrick's eyes when he came to the kitchens for supplies. She heard the whispers of the king's terrifying rages, of objects turned to stone by his touch. She was drowning in guilt. Lord Malachor, however, seemed to flourish in the renewed darkness. He was always at the king's side now, his voice a poisonous whisper in the ruler's ear. Sarys would catch glimpses of him in the courtyard, his posture smug, his eyes glittering with triumph. He had won. The winter was his to command. One afternoon, as she was hauling a heavy bucket of scraps to the refuse pile behind the keep, a voice stopped her. "A pity, isn't it?" She turned to see Malachor leaning against the stone wall, casually cleaning his nails with a small, ornate dagger. To have come so close to the sun, only to be cast back into the dirt. His smile was a venomous slash across his face. Sarys said nothing, her gaze dropping to the ground. She just wanted him to leave. "He truly believed you were the one," Malachor mused, his tone conversational, yet laced with malice. "The prophesied mate. The curse breaker. And you threw it all away. I must admit, I am impressed. I had a rather elaborate plan to be rid of you, but you did my work for me." Her head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "Oh, please," he sneered, pushing off the wall and taking a step closer. His scent was cloying, like wilting flowers and decay. "Did you really think the curse was a simple affliction of blood? It is a spell. A carefully maintained spell that ensures the line of Vorlag remains pliable, controlled. My family has been the keeper of this secret for generations, ensuring the Shadow Kings remain just that. Shadows. Powerful, but tormented. Easy to advise. Easy to manipulate." The blood drained from her face. You are the one doing this to him?" "Doing?" He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "I am merely its steward. And you, my dear scentless filth, you are a complication. Your unique blankness was a threat to the delicate balance. You were draining my influence. But now," he gestured expansively at the grim fortress, "the balance is restored. The king is broken, his heart more stone than flesh. He trusts no one but me. Soon he will be nothing but a figurehead, a stone king on a stone throne, and I will be the true power in this kingdom." It was all a lie. The curse was not just a tragic fate. It was a weapon, wielded by this monster. And her rejection had handed him the final piece he needed to win. "He will find out," she whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and rage. Malachor's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I think not. Because you, my dear, are about to become the villain of this story, the perfect scapegoat for the king's tragic decline." Before she could react, he lunged. He was deceptively fast. He grabbed her, his fingers digging into her arms like talons. He dragged her, kicking and struggling, into a small, dark storage shed nearby. He threw her to the ground, and her head hit the stone floor with a sickening crack. The world swam. Through a haze of pain, she saw him pull several objects from his cloak. A bundle of black feathers tied with human hair. A shard of obsidian covered in jagged runes. A small vial of viscous, dark liquid. He shoved them into the pockets of her apron and into the small satchel where she kept her only possession, a small, smooth stone her mother had given her. Witchcraft, he hissed, his face close to hers. Treason. So sad. The spurned lover trying to curse the king who cast her aside. A classic tale, and one he, in his current state, will be all too willing to believe. He stood up, smiling down at her. Goodbye, little ghost. He slammed the door, and the bolt slid home with a deafening thud. Darkness swallowed her. Hours later, the door was torn from its hinges. Guards stormed in, dragging her from the shed. They ripped the cursed artifacts from her pockets, holding them up for all to see. The whispers started immediately. Witch. Traitor. She cursed him. She was hauled before the throne. The great hall was packed. The entire court was there to witness her judgment. Vorlag sat on his massive stone throne, and he looked like he was a part of it. The gray petrification had consumed half his face, rendering it an expressionless mask. Only one stormy gray eye, filled with a maelstrom of pain and fury, remained. The rest of him was a statue of a king. Malachor stood beside him, the picture of a loyal, grieving advisor. "We found these on her person, Your Majesty," Garrick announced, his voice heavy with regret as he laid the dark objects on a table. Cursed artifacts, the kind used in blood magic to steal a man's vitality. Vorlag's one good eye fixed on her. The hatred in it was a physical force that made her want to crumble. "You did this," he said, his voice a grating whisper of stone on stone. "You were not content to just break my heart. You had to break my kingdom as well." "No," she cried, finding her voice. "It was Malachor. He planted them. He is the one behind the curse." Malachor scoffed, a look of theatrical disbelief on his face. "Your Majesty, the girl is desperate. She lies to save her own skin. I have served your family my entire life. Would I betray the man I consider a son?" Vorlag's gaze did not waver from Cerys. He did not even look at his advisor. In his pain, he could only see one source, one focus for his betrayal. Her. "She will face the trial of flames," the King of Stone decreed, his voice echoing with chilling finality. "At dawn, she will be purged from this castle. From this world." A collective gasp went through the hall. The trial of flames was a death sentence. No one had ever survived it. Cerys's knees gave way. The guards held her up as they dragged her away, her desperate pleas of innocence lost in the noise of the shocked and horrified court. They threw her into the deepest dungeon, a cold, damp cell where the only light was a thin sliver from a grate high above. She was going to die. She was going to die branded a traitor, a witch, while the real monster sat beside the throne. She was going to die knowing that her fear, her one moment of weakness, had not only condemned her, but had handed the man she loved over to his enemy. She curled into a ball on the filthy straw, and for the first time since she was a child, she allowed herself to truly weep. She wept for her mother, for her broken vow, for the king in his stone prison, and for the love that had been born in the firelight, only to be executed in the flames. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, the moments before dawn bleeding across the horizon. Cerys was dragged from her cell and into the main courtyard. A pyre of dry wood had been erected in the center. The air was frigid, her breath pluming in white clouds. The entire keep was assembled, their faces grim and silent in the pre-dawn gloom. She was tied to a thick wooden stake at the center of the pyre. The rough rope bit into her wrists and ankles. This was it. The end. She lifted her head, her gaze sweeping the crowd until she found him. Forlag sat on a temporary throne set up on the battlements, overlooking the courtyard. He was a figure of stone and shadow. Lord Malachor stood beside him, a faint, triumphant smirk on his lips. She looked at Forlag, past the petrified mask, and into his one good eye. She poured every ounce of her feeling into that look. Her regret, her innocence, her unwavering, foolish love. For a flicker of a second, she thought she saw something shift in that stormy gray orb. A flicker of doubt. A memory of the warmth of his study. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of his betrayal. A priest stepped forward, his voice droning on about treason and witchcraft. Saris didn't hear the words. Her mind was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. Her vow. I will never bind myself to a man of pure strength, a man who rules with an iron fist and a cold heart. She had been so wrong. She had seen his strength as a flaw, the same flaw that had made her father cruel. But it wasn't. Forlag's strength was a shield. He had ruled with an iron fist to protect his people from the outside world, and to protect them from the monster inside himself. His heart wasn't cold. It was burning with a pain she couldn't comprehend, and she had thrown gasoline on the flames. Her vow was not a shield of wisdom. It was a cage of fear, and it had locked them both in dungeons. It's not too late, a voice whispered in her soul. Her mother's voice. Your worth is in what you can feel. Love is not a vow of avoidance. It is a choice of acceptance. She had a choice. She could die in fear, or she could die in love. Light the pyre, Forlag commanded, his voice devoid of all emotion. 2 guards with torches approached. The smell of oil and dry wood filled the air. Saris took a deep breath. She would not die a silent ghost. Forlag! Her voice, clear and strong, rang out across the silent courtyard. It was a voice few had ever heard, and it cut through the tension like a blade. Every head, including the king's, snapped towards her. He lied to you, she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. Lord Malachor is the sorcerer. He has nurtured your curse, fed it, used it to control you. Malachor laughed. The desperate cries of a condemned witch, Your Majesty. Pay them no mind. I am not a witch, Karis yelled, straining against her bonds as the guards touched their torches to the kindling. Smoke began to rise, stinging her eyes. I am your mate. The other half of your soul, and I was a fool to deny it. The flames began to lick at the base of the pyre. Heat washed over her. I rejected you out of fear, she confessed, tears streaming down her face, sizzling as they hit the warming air around her. I made a promise I didn't understand. But I see the truth now. I see you. Not the Shadow King, not the stone, but the man inside. And I love him. I love you, Forlag. Her declaration of love, so raw and public, hung in the air. On the battlements, Forlag flinched as if struck. His one good hand flew to his chest over his heart. A crack, like stone breaking, echoed in the silence. A sliver of light shone from his chest. Malachor's eyes widened in fury and panic. It is not possible. She rejected the bond. It is broken. A bond of the soul cannot be broken by words of fear, Karis cried out, the fire now climbing her legs, the heat searing. Only by a failure of the heart. And my heart has not failed. With a roar that was part agony and part release, Forlag surged to his feet. The stone casing on his face and arm cracked and fell away like a shattered shell, revealing the living, breathing man beneath. Light poured from him, a brilliant silver radiance that pushed back the dawn gloom. "You," he breathed, his eyes, both of them now clear and stormy and fixed on her, wide with horrified realization. "Cerys." "Kill her!" Malachor shrieked, his composure gone. He drew a wicked-looking dagger from his robes and lunged at the reborn king. "You will not ruin this." But Vorlog was no longer a broken man. He was the Alpha King, restored. He caught Malachor's wrist in an iron grip, shattering the bones. Malachor screamed, "Garrick!" "To me!" Vorlog bellowed. The loyal Beta and a dozen guards, their faces alight with awe and renewed fealty, swarmed the battlements, surrounding the traitor. But Vorlog had eyes only for Cerys. The pyre was now a raging inferno. Her tunic was catching fire. He didn't hesitate. In a move of impossible speed and grace, he leaped from the battlements. He landed on the courtyard stones with a ground-shaking thud and ran, a blur of motion, straight into the flames. The crowd screamed. He tore through the burning wood, ignoring the fire that licked at his clothes and skin. He reached her, his hands ripping the thick ropes from the stake as if they were thread. He swept her up into his arms, holding her against his chest, shielding her from the worst of the flames. He carried her out of the inferno and collapsed to his knees on the cold stones, cradling her as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. He patted out the small flames on her tunic, his hands gentle, desperate. "Cerys," he whispered, his voice choked with tears. "Forgive me. Forgive me." She coughed, her lungs full of smoke, but she managed a weak smile. She lifted a hand, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, now free of stone. "There is nothing to forgive." He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a kiss of soul-deep recognition, of promises finally kept. It was the sealing of their bond, a public, fiery claiming in front of his entire kingdom. As their lips met, a wave of pure silver energy erupted from them, washing over the courtyard. It was a wave of warmth, of peace, of healing. It was the end of the curse. It was the beginning of everything. 1 year later, the great hall of the Shadow Keep was unrecognizable. What had once been a place of cold stone and stark shadows was now filled with light and warmth. Colorful tapestries depicting the history of a renewed kingdom hung on the walls. The air, once frigid and tense, was filled with the sounds of laughter and music. A grand festival was underway, celebrating the first anniversary of the breaking, the day the curse was shattered, and the queen was claimed. Cerys stood on the dais beside Vorlog's throne, not behind it or below it, but next to it, where her own, slightly more elegant throne of silver birch and white fur now sat. She was no longer in a servant's tunic, but in a gown the color of the winter sky, embroidered with silver roses. She was not the scentless Omega or the kitchen witch. She was Cerys, the heart healer queen. Vorlog stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. He was transformed. The tormented, cold king was gone, replaced by a confident, powerful alpha whose strength was tempered by a deep well of compassion. He smiled often now, a sight that had once been rarer than a summer snow. His people no longer feared him, they revered him. Together, they had remade their world. The harsh laws were softened. The alliance with the southern clans, once strained, was now strong, built on mutual respect rather than fear. The keep was no longer a fortress against the world, but a beacon of hope. Her influence, her quiet empathy, had healed not just the king, but the kingdom. "Are you happy, my love?" Vorlog's deep voice rumbled beside her ear, a sound that never failed to send a shiver of pleasure down her spine. She turned to him, her heart swelling with a love so profound it sometimes stole her breath. "I have never known such happiness was possible," He leaned in, his lips brushing hers. The bond between them was a living thing, a constant current of warmth and love and understanding that flowed between them. They rarely needed words. One of the most curious miracles of the bond's healing was what it had done for her. She was no longer truly scentless. To others, she carried only the faintest, cleanest smell, like fresh snow. But to Vorlag, her mate, she had a scent all her own. He described it as winter roses and wood smoke, a fragrance that was both delicate and strong, just like her. It was a scent for him alone, a private, intimate secret in a world built on public displays. Garrick approached the dais, a wide, honest smile on his face. He bowed deeply. "Your Majesties, Lord Fenrir has arrived." Cerys's breath hitched. Her father. She had not seen him since the day he sold her. He had been summoned to the celebration, a royal command she knew he could not refuse. She saw him then, making his way through the crowd. He looked older, smaller than she remembered. He approached the throne, his eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of her, his disgraced daughter, standing as queen. He fell to one knee. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice strained, addressing Vorlag. He did not dare look at Cerys. "Rise, Lord Fenrir," Vorlag said, his tone level but with an underlying edge of steel. "You will address your queen." Slowly, her father rose and finally met her eyes. She saw a maelstrom of emotions there: shock, regret, and a dawning, terrible understanding of what he had thrown away. "Cerys," he began. "It is, Your Majesty," she corrected him, her voice quiet but firm. There was no malice in it, only a statement of fact. She was no longer the frightened girl he had discarded. "You are welcome in our halls, father. But know that in this kingdom, worth is not measured by scent or strength, but by the content of one's heart. It is a lesson we have all had to learn." He bowed his head, properly chastised. "Yes, Your Majesty." He retreated back into the crowd, a diminished man. Cerys felt not triumph, but a quiet sense of closure. That part of her life was over. Vorlag squeezed her hand. "Well said, my queen." She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their people celebrate. She saw Isolde, now married to a minor lord, offer her a small, respectful nod. She saw Helga directing the servants with a new, less severe efficiency. The world had changed. Later that evening, they stood on the balcony of their chambers, the same room where she had first soothed the beast within him. The festival lights twinkled below, and the moon, a reassuring crescent, shone down upon them. "A year ago," she mused, tracing the strong line of his jaw, "I was on my knees in the dirt, and you were a king of stone." "And now," he whispered, pulling her flush against him, his arms wrapping around her in a possessive, loving embrace, "I am a king of flesh and blood, and you are the sun that thawed my world." He rested his forehead against hers, his stormy eyes soft with adoration. "You are my miracle, Cerys." She smiled, a secret, happy smile. "Perhaps we have one more miracle in us." His eyes widened slightly, a question in their depths. She took his large, calloused hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. His eyes searched hers, and when he saw the confirmation there, a look of pure, unadulterated joy transformed his face. He let out a whoop of laughter, a sound so free and full of life it seemed to make the very stars shine brighter. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around under the moonlight, the scentless Omega and the cursed King. Two broken halves, rejected by their world, who had found each other in the shadows. And together, they had built a new world in the light, a kingdom founded not on power, but on a love that had been strong enough to conquer a curse, heal a nation, and turn a winter of despair into an eternal spring.